He didn't know if he was in the home. He didn't know if he was standing next to him. He didn't know if he was standing outside. He didn't know if he was in another room. He didn't know if he was sleeping. Mr. Wagrowski couldn't tell you what was going on, other than James Crumbley's son handling that firearm. Was it unsupervised? We don't know. Was it supervised? We don't know. We don't know. So any statement by Mr. Wagrowski that James had to have heard that is an assumption. It's not based on fact, and it's not based on evidence. If the prosecution had evidence that James was concerned about his son's mental stability, or if his son had asked him for mental health treatment and it was denied by James, you would have seen that. Not a statement by his son to a friend or a writing in a journal, a statement by James that he acknowledges that his son was having issues, that his son was having a hard time, that his son needed help. None of you saw that. None of you saw that because it's not true. James had no idea that his son was having a hard time. Instead, you saw texts between James's son and his friend in April of 2021, where his son says he's going to tell his parents about the issues he's having. You also heard testimony from James's sister, who said she saw him within a day or two, maybe 3 days, of those texts being sent to his friend in Florida after their mother passed away. James and his sister's mother passed away. She spent a week or a week and a half and saw them, saw James and his son, and saw no concerns. Not worried, didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, wasn't made aware of anything, no concerns. You heard that on November 30th of 2021, James drove his son to school. You saw the video of James dropping his son off. You heard that later when James went to the school with his wife to meet with his son and the school counselor, Sean Hopkins, and the dean of students, Nick Ejak, that James had told them, or that James had had a conversation that he had talked to his son that morning, told his son he loved him. We just want you to do your schoolwork. We want you to do your best. There was never a conversation about, Dad, I'm having a really hard time. Dad, I really need some help. In fact, there were no concerns expressed whatsoever. James had no knowledge that there was an issue. You also heard Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak both testify that in the office, sitting in the office, that James sat next to his son, right in front of Sean Hopkins' desk. Sat next to him, went over the piece of the math assignment with him, the drawings, what was on there, that he was caring, that he told his son, you can talk to me. You can talk to other people. There was some reference to a journal. There was no indication that James knew what the journal looked like, whether or not his son was even writing in a journal, where it was, how often he used it. No indication at all, just that one may exist. And again, in that meeting, there were no comments, whether either before James got there or after he arrived, from James's son to the school counselor or the dean of students saying, I really want some help. I'm really having a hard time. I really need to see someone. I've been trying to talk to my parents and they haven't been listening to me and I need you to tell them. That didn't happen. Instead, Mr. Hopkins testified that he had concerns about the level of although appropriate, the level of sadness that James's son was experiencing. Sadness associated with the losses that he'd had that year. He lost his grandmother. He lost their Great Pyrenees dog. His friend moved away. He had a hard time with COVID. He struggled with virtual school. Mr. Hopkins was concerned about the sadness and wanted James's son to see someone to ensure that it didn't get any worse. Not that he had to see someone right now. It's an emergency. He has to see someone right now. That's not what was said. In fact, if you recall Mr. Hopkins' testimony, and I believe Mr. Ejak said the same thing, that James and his wife were told that the school was going to follow up with them within 48 hours. Now, in Mr. Hopkins' head, he testified he was thinking it was going to be the next morning, but he told them 48 hours. You heard Mr. Hopkins testify that James's son said he wanted to stay in school. In fact, he even asked for his homework while sitting in the office waiting for his parents. He asked for them to go get his homework. So they went and got his backpack. They brought it back. He started working on schoolwork. His attendance wasn't bad. There's some question about whether or not he missed one or more days of school that year, but his attendance wasn't bad. His grades weren't terrible. They were average, according to Sean Hopkins. There were no concerns, even by Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak, beyond the sadness that they saw James's son was experiencing. The absence of evidence that James knew about the struggles that his son was having can be your reasonable doubt. You heard from James himself more than once. You heard him tell the police that there weren't any issues with his son. Within an hour of the shooting at Oxford High School, James was at the police station with his wife, interviewing with law enforcement, talking to them, saying, my son was a great kid. I think he used the word perfect. That his grades were mediocre, again, although Sean Hopkins said they were average. But that he'd never had any disciplinary issues. Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak confirmed that. They had no disciplinary history with James's son. And even if you have a question about how great of a kid James thought his son was, Christy Gibson Marshall said the same thing to you. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But Christy Gibson Marshall also said that James's son was a good kid. Christy said that her testimony was that she was standing in the hallway. She had spotted the shooter coming down the hall with a firearm, with a gun in his hand. She saw that there was an injured student in the hallway. She walked up to the student, was standing next to it. You saw the video. She's standing next to the student who's injured on the floor. The shooter gets closer, and she realizes that it's James's son. And her first thought was that it couldn't be right. With a gun in his hand and an injured student in front of her, smelling cap gun, she didn't think that was right. Even in those moments. Going back to Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak, two people who met with and talked to James's son on November 30th of 2021, at one point for over an hour without James and his wife there. They talked about a variety of topics. This was 2 hours before the shooting began. They said that based on the explanations that they were given about the drawings on the math assignment, that they weren't concerned. Kids draw violent things. Kids draw guns and bullets. That the confirmation combined with the confirmation from James and his wife about what was going on in their son's life, in combination with the explanations that they were given by James and his wife's son, that they weren't concerned. There was an explanation about interest in video game design. They looked a little bit about video game design. Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak weren't concerned on November 30th of 2021, 2 hours before the shooting started. Both Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak told you that guns are not uncommon in homes in Oxford. It's a hunting community. That it's not uncommon for students to handle guns in their homes or to go to the shooting range. That they knew that James's son had gone to the shooting range the weekend before with his mom and that he had access to a firearm. They didn't ask any more about this, about access to a firearm or having a firearm in the home, because they weren't concerned that James's son was a danger to anyone. They weren't concerned. Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak testified that they had concerns related to the effects of the losses that James's son had experienced in that year. There was testimony that James's son's level of sadness was appropriate given various factors, but that it wasn't concerning. They just wanted to address it to ensure it didn't get any worse, because they'd seen sadness get worse and have issues with other students, according to Sean Hopkins' testimony.